It gives me great pleasure to be back in Buenos Aires and virtually with Lila Pinto, who is my dear colleague and friend, and who actually was the person who constructed what we call our design research process. She did it through deliberate research. We had consultants who visited the university. And in the end, we found ourselves with a very interesting way of simplifying our project development process without making it simple-minded. So what I'd like to do is show you a representation of that process that is represented by a spiral. And the spiral has a very important significance. The spiral represents the fact that it's not a complete circle, so it's never complete, so that you are constantly iterating based on what it is you've developed and assessed so that you can make changes in the next iteration. One begins with what we call the discovery process, which is targeted at understanding what it is in the content that we are attempting to teach that has not been fully realized. And then we ask ourselves the question of whether or not technology can assist us in exploiting that particular deficiency. The fact of the matter is it may not in many cases. It may require a different tactic. But this is a place where we'd like to begin with the content, with the subject, and with the elaboration of possible interventions, some of which can be technological. If they are technological, then the next step is to ask ourselves, well, what design, what kind of software, what kind of interactivity do we want to, in a sense, construct in order to realize these goals? We then engage, after we've made those decisions, in the actual development of that technology, and then we actually take the technology we've developed, integrated into the curriculum, and use that as a test case in the classroom, and then we assess what it is in fact we've achieved, and then we move to make revisions on what it is that we've already done. This is the design research process, simply stated. It begins with defining a purpose, and then creating a design, and then executing a test, and then evaluating the effectiveness of the test, and then potentially iterating again to improve what it is we did the first time. We are not committed to only using technology to improve the curriculum that we have discovered problems in. We are open to using it, but it isn't the exclusive solution to every educational problem. One of the concerns that I think was expressed in the correspondence I received from the conference was the fact that will the model become somehow calcified and reified? Well, no more than a person who chooses to live a life of purpose and open to really constantly redefining the purpose of that life. This is a way of working that allows you to be open to any kind of potential interventions that might in fact improve the educational experience, but at the same time not necessarily depend only on the technology. The fact of the matter is most of our work really has to do with a very powerful blend of the two. My plan now is to actually show you a project that was filmed by Apple a number of years ago, but I think represents all of the different criteria that we've begun to discuss. But you'll see a visualization of it, and in effect a good pedagogical technique where you can see an example of something that was created using the criteria I described. And so we're going to begin with an archaeological simulation that was developed first in the 3rd grade and then moved to the 6th grade. The project that I am going to show you began when I made a visit to the 4 corners of the United States, where an archaeologist and the ranger of the 4 corners went on a 2-week camping trip with me where we encountered all of the different Anasazi pre-Columbian sites that were available for view. They decided they'd be willing to come back to New York where we could use that kind of archaeological site as a platform for building some kind of an experience for students that was hands-on initially, not digital, not rooted in computers. And the film then will progress to show you how we went from a 3rd grade version to a 6th grade version that required computers. After that, I will then describe to you what I see as the primary features of this hybrid integration of the curriculum rooted in archaeology and effectively the technologies that made it possible for us to have a deeply collaborative, constructive environment. One important caveat is the fact that the design research project, the design research method, did not effectively act as the foundation for building this project, but rather the project acted as the foundation for building the design research process. So the example of a 6th grade curriculum that you will see is actually going to be implemented years before we actually created the design research project, when Leela and I began to work on its theoretical foundations. So what you will see is from the early 90s, and the design research process really comes along close to a decade after that, but deeply rooted in the principles we discovered in the process of building the archaeological simulation that you're about to see.
For an archaeologist, there's nothing more exciting than digging. You're looking for possible answers, and the excitement and the interest is in finding those possible answers and sharing those answers and those experiences with fellow workers.
Our belief is that you have to trust students with the artifacts of the past and give them the task of attempting to make sense of it. So that the Archaeotype program, for instance, is really based in the notion that if you give children access to the artifacts of ancient Greece or the artifacts of ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, that they will in fact be able to reconstruct a historical narrative of their own.
Well, what we're doing is simulation, and we're mapping our artifacts and the walls we found on this grid, so that if we find something that relates to another artifact, we can go back, look at the map, say, hey, this bell looks like another one we found.
In learning about the past or learning about any phenomenon, one doesn't look at a single attribute or single artifact. One has to amass a number of objects and make inferences of those and construct a database.
Well, we have to dig up every single place, and that takes a long time considering that we find a lot of artifacts.
We're trying to figure out what happened here, what this whole place is.
And we're trying to date it, but we think it's in the late 8th century because we found a Neo-Hittite helmet that came from the late 8th century, and it was made of bronze.
I can decide what culture I want to use, what aspects of the culture I want represented in the archaeological record, and then the students can go from there. And even though the students realize it is a simulation, it has been constructed as an educational tool, it becomes real to them.
There might have been kind of a headquarters for the commanders and chiefs, which was right here.
On our site, if you look at it, there's a thing that Kim thinks is an altar.
And there was like a guard tower over here.
A lot of times in Greek mythology, gods are symbolized as animals.
And this over here was where they kept their prisoners.
If I had lectured 3 weeks or 6 weeks on a series, the students would have never remembered more than a fraction of what I had told them.
The fear is always that we're going to lose the kids to this tunnel vision, this locked-in vision into another TV tube. And we find that when we're most successful in deploying the technology in a classroom, the kids are actually away from the computer more than they're at the computer. If you go in there on a typical day, there's probably half or a third of the class in there. The rest of the kids have fanned out throughout the school to go find things that are necessary for their investigation. Kids in our archetype class are able to use the Louvre Museum as essentially an extension of their own library. And that's creating an environment where kids are increasingly going to be able to make the kinds of discoveries that up until now have only been, have been reserved for scholars to make.
We're not here to provide the students with an opportunity to enhance their memory skills. We're here to teach the students what it is to learn. And when you see the students becoming so excited, when you see them so involved in the learning and so passionate about what they're doing, then as a teacher, I feel that I fulfilled my duty. This is what I want to do as a teacher. Motivate the student to become a self-learner.
If you're doing it yourself, you also learn how to find it, and it will help you later on.
What schools are increasingly are watchtowers with windows out onto the same world. And the digital technologies are going to provide those windows of access to a common universe. And schools and educators have to begin to prepare for that. That's an inevitability.
The textbook is 400 years old. It has a tremendous force behind it, and people think in its terms. And much that has been already created for the computer in some way has been created in its image. We're trying to explore what the new forms are that are possible within the new technologies. If you're going to do that, you can't be religious about the textbook, and you can't be religious about any of the educational traditions that have effectively been with us for 400 years.
The computers that were used in this project will probably surprise you. There were 5 daisy-chained computers, all Mac Classics, or just the version that came right after the Mac Classic. And in each of the computers was buried effectively hundreds of artifacts that each team of 4 students had to dig up and then catalog. The cataloging process required their entering information into a database, and then in that database they could actually critique each other's analysis of the artifacts. So the technologies were minimal. In addition to the technologies themselves, we had the antiquities collection of the Louvre on video disc, which is the only thing you could actually get to it during this period of time, where they did their research in order to find points of comparison between what it is they dug up and what in fact the Louvre had in its collection. But commenting more on the pedagogy, I think, is important than the technology, because I think from the film, and I hope you will watch this again and maybe even again after you watched it again, you can see the motivation. You can see the illumination of a child's mind who's engaged in trying to discover things, find out things that they didn't know before, puzzled by things they encounter that have no labels on them, no textbooks, no scripts telling them what they are. So motivation, I think, is one of the key factors that we've in fact been able to focus on using the process that we're talking about. The fact that if you go back to the video, you'll see significant collaboration between and among the students. Because ultimately what their goal was to, in teams, come up with a narrative about the part of the site that they in fact were responsible for. By the way, the screen of the computer was 1/100th the size of the field of artifacts that they in fact had to explore. So the collaboration became critical. It doesn't really take much to argue the fact that critical thinking is a very important part of what this project was about, where students were not asked to memorize things and repeat them, but really to juxtapose things, to be able to draw inferences, to derive generalizations, to debate each other about those generalizations as they came to be. The narration that they would build would ultimately be a function of bringing together all 4 quadrants of the excavation. We did 2 excavations, which may confuse you when you look at the video. One excavation was of ancient Greece, and one excavation was of contemporary Iraq. Tilbarsik is the name of the city. It was done from the archaeological records of Tilbarsik that archaeologists at Columbia had actually excavated. Distinct from those 2, the initial experience that students had in the 3rd grade was done in a hands-on way in a giant box that we constructed and put in the backyard of the school. And from that we derived the possibility of trying to do a larger excavation that was simulated within the computers. That is the critical transition in my career between working with hands-on constructivist experiences and being able to see the power of the computer as a constructivist tool. All of this is deeply rooted in what ultimately became the protocol for design research. A very important part of what happened that we didn't anticipate had to do with the mobilization of the school's resources. What do I mean by that? The fact is that when students couldn't figure out what it was that they had dug up and it wasn't in the antiquities collection of the Louvre, they went to the librarians. But the librarians didn't know any more than they did about what it is that they had dug up. And so it mobilized the librarians to start to build collections around the curriculum that were archives that would act as research resources for the students who were engaged in these different projects. Sometimes the resource that was quote-unquote mobilized was really people who knew things that were dormant, like myself. I had studied Latin and Greek. Students would come to me with images of things that represented something they'd dug up, and it was written in Greek, and they'd say, well, what does that mean? I'd say, it means truth. And they would then walk away. And they began to see the school not so much as a place where they had to do what it was that they were told in sequence, but they began to see the school as a large resource that was filled with human resources and with text resources, with filmic resources, and ultimately now with digital resources. So this was the point of expansion of my consciousness about what it is that you can do with a digital media. Effectively, what we accomplished was we surfaced dormant resources that all schools have. The project that we took great pride in after we'd done a number of these different experiments, really we described as the school in a library rather than a library in a school, so that the entire enterprise of the school was intended to be a resource for students. Not the library was not a separate little isolated place where you went to get a book. So we expanded the notion of library to mean the culture of the school. But of course one can make these claims and potentially be wrong. So the most important part of that research cycle, or at least equally significant part of that research cycle that we've shown you, is the actual evaluations you do. And we did do evaluations with our colleagues from Teachers College, Columbia University, and got remarkable results. These results will be on a website that will be sent to you so that you can read particularly the archaeological excavation, although we have annual reports that are 300 pages for the whole project, which we did across all the different grades. The last two things that I would like to say to you are responses to questions I received from the conference. They're relatively simple responses, and one has to do with what is the most important element in our design research process. I think our most important element in the design research process is you begin in the subject, you begin in the content, you begin in the questions, you begin in the curiosity, you begin in the puzzles. You do not begin with the technology and ask yourself, how am I going to use this blog? How am I going to use this wiki? How am I going to use this other tool? You may come back and say, I see how to use this blog now in order to enhance and extend what it is we wish to do. But you do not begin there, because you are in danger then of not really advancing anything you do except the sale of those technologies. The second question I'd like to respond to is directly derived from my response to the first question, and that is, where should teachers begin? Teachers should begin acknowledging their own frustration with what it is that they're attempting to teach, and then trying to discover and think about what are the ways in which you might address those difficulties or obstacles that could deploy potentially technologies or not, but being honest to yourself about what it is that acts as an obstacle in your work is always the most important point of departure. As a matter of fact, it's not only the most important point of departure in education, it's the most important point of departure in your life. I'm so delighted to have had this opportunity to talk to you. I'm so sorry I'm not present there. I had such a wonderful time in Buenos Aires as host of the hosted by the president and the provost, and who were both mentors for Dr. Pinto, who came to Columbia and really developed our design research process. And feel free to reach out in any way that we might be able to further this conversation, as awkward as it is as I sit behind this camera and talk to two dear friends of mine. So be well, and I hope you have a terrific conversation.